Today we talk a bit about the theoretical part. There was an earlier section that we didn't get to because I thought it was too soon. And this is something that involves, major thinkers, many books. So what I just want to do is not to sort of describe, but to pull out elements from each of these thinkers. When the city emerges as a significant space, there were all kinds of interpretations about what was happening. Now, in the Western tradition, there is a very strong belief, not explicitly indicated as belief, but it's sort of like almost an assumption, that it is the West that produced, especially Europe, a bit of North America, maybe, and Latin America, but the West in that broad sense, that produces a kind of theorization about the city. I think that might well be an error that is a function of knowing and not knowing enough of what the urban traditions of scholarship were in a country like India, in certain African countries, in China, in Indonesia, all countries that have very significant levels of urbanization. They may not have started at the same time as the West, but still. So I just want to emphasize that. Now, most of the scholarship that we deal with in English is very much a Western scholarship. It's a very good scholarship, so it's worthwhile knowing about it. But it is really important to understand that there are other traditions, that this is not the only one. I just was part of a big project where we tried to understand some of those other traditions of developing sort of an emergent notion about what is a city. You're with me, right? You understand what I'm saying, and also what we need to sort of guard against. Now, in the West, it really is the modern city, the so-called modern city, that emerges in the early 1900s. And you can think of London, you can think of Berlin, which captures the imagination of scholars. There is a whole other scholarship, on the Roman cities, but that belongs truly to another epoch. Medieval towns. Europe was full of medieval towns. Those towns were quite urban. They were very urban. But that is not the scholarship that we're focusing on. We're focusing on the modern city, which is the city of the industrial era, the city, that we're sort of more familiar with. Now, a key assumption in all of this is to view sort of modernity as a fundamental break with past forms of social organization for human community. Now, this is only partly correct, because in many ways we had so many cities in medieval times and in antiquity. So it is, what you're also capturing in this scholarship is a very European-centered analysis. Now, the European scholars who were doing this were very, very good. They were very, very smart. So it's a pleasure to read them. But I want to keep emphasizing to what extent this is one vector, one way of understanding the whole question. So I'm just going to, if we can all read together. So the key assumption, modernity is a fundamental break with past forms of social organization for human community. New technologies, mass production, emergence of a world economy, wage labor, rationalization and commodification of time, a very important sort of subject, all lead and presuppose new organizational forms in cities and of cities. All right, so you're still with me, right? Or have I already lost you with this first very long paragraph? Now, in the social sciences, let's just say in sociology, so as a discipline, sociology emerges out of a concern with transitions from a condition, I'm just reading the text so that we're all on the same page, where particular forms of association, small towns, religious congregations, etc., prevail, to a whole new epoch, which is increasingly dominated by modern forms. Now, I say it in quotes because that's the language they use, these scholars use. One might want to say, well, can we use another term than modern for everything, you know? But anyhow, so the city then emerges as a lens, as a window through which to study this transition and the new organizational forms that come with it. So the city is not just about, you know, what happens later on. You're just documenting the good and the bad things about cities. No, here the notion is to use the emergence of cities as a way of studying a transition. That marks a very specific project. The whole effort, the scholarship that I'm going to discuss with you, and I want you to know these stuff. I don't want you to be experts on each of these scholars, that would be impossible, but I want you to sort of have a sense. It's not even so much about the people who are making these analyses, but it is to have a sense as to how they begin to construct, literally construct, text around the city. So, because today, for instance, when you deal with the digital, you see a lot of scholars who begin to construct text, 20, 30 years ago, about the digital. How do we narrate it? And the same thing here, a bit, if you want, with the city. I'm just doing this, right? So not till 1900 was there a predominantly urban society. This, to me, this is a standard sentence, and this is, to me, a very Western angle, because there were other urban societies in the world. So that in itself is also interesting. In other words, here you have the Western world amazed at what it is generating and thinks it is the only one. You know what I'm talking about, right? So that, anyhow, so in the literature you literally see, like London is the first big significant city. My God, what about Rome? What about some of the cities in the East, etc., etc. Anyhow, London was what we can say about London is that it was the fastest growing major city in the world in the mid-1800s. It just took off, and we all know why, right? Partly because its large empire allowed it to learn all kinds of modes of production. From India, they learned all kinds of techniques, and because it was a very commercial country, that's for sure, partly because of empire building, etc., etc. Now, for Marx, Karl Marx is hanging in there. We all know, who Karl Marx is, right? Who does not? I'm actually curious. Would be ashamed probably to say, I don't know who Karl Marx is. Anyhow, we know who Karl Marx is. We know that he was hanging around, he's German, but he's hanging around England because England is where the Industrial Revolution is taking off, and so he gets very interested. So by mid-1900s, most of what were, what we now think of as industrial societies were already happening. Now for Marx, back to Marx, this growth and the massive transformation of workers into wage labor, right? Their concentration in poor housing, etc., was an outcome and a conditionality and a necessity, if you want, for capitalism, right? And he wrote a famous book called Das Kapital. All right. Now, Tönnies, now I'm going to start embarrassing you. So, who has heard of Tönnies? Very impressive. Nobody. Ferdinand Tönnies is a very famous scholar. In my view, he got a lot of stuff wrong, but that doesn't preclude that he isn't a very famous scholar. Anyhow, so Tönnies represents one mode of seeing, and then eventually I'll bring in Simmel, Georg Simmel. Has anybody heard of Georg Simmel? Okay, already better. So Georg Simmel is truly, I think, a very interesting thinker. So for Ferdinand Tönnies, who writes a super famous book, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, that means community and society, he is totally obsessed with how the new modernity that is installing itself in Europe actually moves away from community, the communal mode, and towards sort of, the shapeless modernity that he really didn't like at all. Urban society is marked by impersonal relationships. For him, that was a no-no. For Simmel, the notion of the impersonal for me too, by the way, is extremely attractive. That you can be in a city where not everything is personal, where there is a whole zone and moments of the day that are marked by the impersonal. You don't know who they are, those people, nor are you interested in knowing that, but they're part, of the landscape, so to say. So anyhow, urban society, here are all the negatives that Turney sees. Urban society is marked by impersonal relationships, calculation. Calculation not in the sense that you are wicked and calculating how do I destroy my neighbor, but calculation in the sense that a whole new economic mode sets in, where you have to sort of calculate. And self-interest is the organizing logic for social action, all of those things. Social solidarity is maintained by formal authority. For Turney, that is a negative. He wants a social solidarity that emerges from the people, that emerges from the community. So I repeat, social solidarity is maintained by formal authority, contracts, and laws. To him, that is not positive. To a more modernist person, that is very positive. That it is not personal, that it is impersonal, that there is something formal, that there are contracts, and that there are laws. Calculation, which is ascendant at that point, is a poor substitute for what Turney appreciates, which is common sentiment. In other words, small town, small village, everybody knows each other, and you sort of agree on a whole bunch of things, etc., etc. So those are sort of very different modes. Now Durkheim, who has heard of Durkheim? Ah, very good. Durkheim is truly a French-style rationalist, thinker and theorist. So for Durkheim, the shift from mechanical to organic solidarity, those are his two terms, okay? Mechanical to organic solidarity has many parallels with what Turney's community to society transition entails, all right? In mechanical solidarity, this is Durkheim, the social bond, do we have it?
Trying to figure it
wow.
out. I'm not sure.
In mechanical solidarity, the social bond is based on common worldviews, based on common experiences, right? In organic solidarity, the social bond arises in spite of complex division of labor and the rise of individualism. So the equivalent of the small town, the small community, is this organic. In mechanical solidarity. The small town, the village is mechanical solidarity. Okay, fine. We have a few interruptions here, I'm sorry. And okay, so there is a social bond in the modern city, but it sort of arises in spite of, and in spite of all the other things that are sort of killing it. But it is there. Huh? But it is very different from the small village. Unlike Tony's, for Durkheim, that S is social. For Durkheim's social life, particularly urban, rests on shared abstract principles. And it values individuality. It values difference. This is the opposite of Turney's. So these, okay. Are you still with it? Is this all clear what I'm talking? I just want you to get the contrast. What I want you to be aware of, here are these cities, emergent cities, massive things compared to the village. Here are also a whole set of interpreters who engage that and wind up with very different interpretations and very different evaluations. What is negative for Turney's is not necessarily a negative for some of the other thinkers, right? So, and also what is important, it's just a question of almost of literacy about this scholarship, is to understand the languages that they were using, the words that they were using. These are words like mechanical solidarity. I mean, who uses that term today? Nobody, except if you're writing about Durkheim. But they were struggling on the language vector. I would argue that in many ways, and the reason I want you to sort of nail this down a bit in your brains, is that today, I think we have also entered, I'll talk about that in a later class, we have also entered a period where the language to capture the city is lacking. We need new concepts. We need new instruments. So, and there are all kinds of different ways in which different scholars or different, types of settings generate a different type of language. So I just would like for people to be aware of these differences, aware of this notion that they are working at producing a language that actually captures this condition of the emergent city. So on the final one, unlike Tony's, for Durkheim's, I repeat, social life, particularly urban social life, rests on shared abstract principles. Now, we cannot say that about today's cities. Shared abstract principles, and at the same time, it values individuality. I think that part is part of our modernity today, that we value individuality. But he throws in it, and this is sort of kind of almost, Durkheim is not a romantic, but is a romanticism about this notion that there is an Uber sort of, Uber, now every time you say Uber, people think of the car. I mean it as a sort of very high level, framing that has to do still with abstract principles that we all share. Today's cities are the opposite. There are no abstract principles that we all share. People barely, manage to negotiate, though the city is one of the spaces where we can negotiate these differences. Now, Simmel. Simmel is in Berlin. He's just a brilliant philosopher, and he has truly his own sort of way of thinking about it all. So while he shares elements with Tönnies and Durkheim, he really goes in another direction. So unlike Tönnies, and to some extent unlike the Frenchman, Durkheim, he has zero nostalgia for the pre-industrial world. Because up till then, there was a real sort of a sense, oh my God, what are we getting ourselves into? We're leaving the nice comforts, etc. Simmel, he's a whole new modernity. That is what Simmel represents, a completely different way. He values what the others hated: standardization, calculation of time, the new money economy, the notion that there is a cold, intellectual, blasé urban attitude. That's great. That is, to some extent, also partly a romanticism about the city. But that, Simmel's way of putting it, he's not the only one, is really what captures, I would say, the way the writing about cities happened, really into the, I would say, into the 40s or something like that. It was that kind of sense of the radically alone urbanite, alone but indestructible. That is sort of an image that he has a phrase like that. So he sees the urban subject, the urbanite, the person who's the urbanite, as really strong, but alone. That's quite different from some of the others. Now, he values the specialized division of labor, because when he's talking, what you begin to have is many different economies, many different types of jobs. It's not like the village, you're a farmer, you're a whatever, so that's the other extreme. So the specialized division of labor forces one to play multiple roles. And the Chicago school really takes that to a whole new level, and I want to get to that. So here is the quote from Simmel: "Who I am," this is critical, "is not simply what I do ordinarily." Whereas in the village, if you are the person who raises the cows or whatever, that is a bit your identity. For what Simmel begins to say, and I repeat, the Chicago school makes a real thick job out of that, is who I am is not simply what I do ordinarily. And there you begin to detect our modernity, because we think that way a bit. Nobody's going to flatten me into what I have or what I do not have, what my work is. Except if you're a super millionaire, you want to be identified, you want to be flattened into being a super millionaire. But in general, the masses of the people. Now, out of this comes a higher level of intellectual engagement with the environment not as in climate change, the environment as in urban setting or versus rural setting or whatever, and individuality. Now, the individuality bit of us humans has always been there, but there was not necessarily always a discourse about individuality. I mean, the Romans, who were deeply urban in many ways, they didn't have a discourse on individuality. This is truly something that begins in the 1900s in the West. And so you have these scholars who are really engaging, that there is a lot of stuff there that they want to understand and that they begin to narrate. So it's this juxtaposition also, and again, it's a romanticism as well. I have freedom, but I'm lonely. But I'm alone and strong. It's sort of beautiful. And there is a whole set, I don't know if people ever saw sort of the French Nouvelle Vague, etc., those kinds of films that were sort of capturing that, that individuality and the price that you pay for that. Now, Walter Benjamin, who has heard of Walter Benjamin? I think you might actually enjoy reading Walter Benjamin. For those of you who have never, he's really, he's a much admired. These are very famous writers, by the way, and scholars that I'm talking about. So Walter Benjamin, he has a totally different take on the matter. So Walter Benjamin finds, I'm just keeping to the text so that we can, so I just want to make sure that it gets ingrained in. So Walter Benjamin finds in complex modern cities, especially in 19th century Paris, that is where he was dwelling, the roots of a new type of public culture, and that is really his contribution. Suddenly there is a notion of public culture, not just monuments and rules of the game, no, a public culture that is made by people, by institutions, etc., etc. Now, in fact, this is my thing here, what I add there. No matter what all is taking place in Paris at the time, such as a lot of manufacturing, but the factories in Paris were often very beautiful buildings. They were in the city of Paris. There is a lot of manufacturing, but all that Benjamin sees is the culture of spectators and consumers that marks the modern city. Now, if any of you has read some of the literature on the big, how do you call these big, like the Goldman Sachs, etc.? No, Goldman Sachs is finance. No. I meant the Saks, Fifth Avenue. These big, I never go shop. These big shops where you find everything. Apartment stores, department stores, apartment, whatever they are called. Anyhow, they are emergent. They are emergent also in New York City, by the way, and in Philadelphia. And people are just fascinated by that, And so it is this notion of a culture also of spectators, that you are looking at stuff. We now are all in such a mad rush, we don't spectate very much. So for Benjamin, the data is literature, the literature that is being written, commerce, the way commerce is emergent, that way of commerce, mass entertainment, like he really loved to just sit in these cafes and watch people moving, shopping, sitting, other people sitting, a spectacle, So it is also the cultural ferment, if you want, of 19th century Paris, where you have extraordinary combinations of, very creative types, as we might call them today. Now, the locus for Benjamin, the locus of sociability shifts from community, family, church, etc., to streets, cafes, resorts. The resulting consciousness of individual freedom entails, at the same time, growing estrangement from older ties. So now I want to emphasize again that Paris was also a place full of factories. No matter how beautiful the buildings may have looked, there were factories. This is absolutely of zero interest to Benjamin, and it's just not in play in his understanding of the city, whereas, of course, for many others, the factories in the cities are what sort of brings large populations together. If you think of Chicago, you know, hey, without the factories, what would Chicago have been? You know, there wouldn't be a Chicago, so to speak. Benjamin completely out of that. And it's really, I mean, reading him is absolutely a pleasure, I must tell you. So, Growing Estrangement from Older Ties, we did that. Now, Mumford. Who's heard of Mumford? That's an American writer. Aha, 3 of you. I exaggerate. There might be a few more in there. But now, Mumford, who wrote a famous book called The Culture of Cities. Cities are crucial to human development. He does find a very serious problem with the cities that he got to know. He was basically living in New York, but then leaves New York. And so this is a figure of the mid-1900s, but maybe already early 1900s a bit. Now, so the city's diversity of time structures, this is Mumford. He writes very, very well, by the way. Very good. So the city's diversity, so you can pick it up on here. The city's diversity of time structures, right? You know what that means? What would that mean? Well, the routines, you know, in each sector has routines of time, etc. You know, there is a night, the day, etc. But you know, all the things that happen in a city that have to do with work life and family life, etc. So the city's diversity of time structures make history and culture visible. Now, when you think about it, that's actually a very intelligent sentence. You know, that because of all of that, what you see is history and culture become visible. Rather than being an abstraction, you can actually see it. You can see different cultures of work, different cultures as cultures, you know, theater, this, that. So he sees in the city that set of issues and a few others, which I want to go to now. So further, the mind takes form in the city. That's a very big statement. You know what I mean? Because the mind can take shape in other. Anyhow, but the city, in other words, has the strength to alter a few things in your mind, is another way of putting it. What for Simmel was an ambivalent valuing of the city. He doesn't see the city as perfect, as this and that. For Mumford is a horror at the negatives of modern city life. He loved the medieval city. He thought the contemporary city was a disaster. Simmel is far more modern in that sense. Mumford is a bit of a romantic. He has an image of the city, you know, a city that doesn't quite exist anymore, and he sees the modern city, and he says, oh my God. And he's talking about a modern city that is not today's modern city. I think he would really be ill about today's. But there's a kind of a real romanticism. Is a horror of the negatives of modern city. His nostalgia, he has a nostalgia for an older era, is not Turney's. For Turney's, it's the loss of community, because society emerges. It is for the medieval city which he saw as a balance of dense neighborhoods, identities, and broader civic unity. I mean, wow, you know, tears go down my cheek. I mean, this is so absolutely a world where both community and society were urban. Now, when I have those little shorties, CY, SY, that is community and society, okay? So you get the picture. So what happens to, I actually got to know Mumford. We had a country place, my husband and I, not far from, because he leaves the city. He is so disgusted with New York City because it doesn't fit at all his medieval town, which I'm grateful for, by the way, that it didn't fit, but that's another matter. And he moves to a tiny, tiny little town outside, you know, in northern New York, but a rural area. And he basically lives most of his life in that town, even as he keeps on writing all these books on cities. So it's sort of an interesting, you know, we humans do that kind of stuff. A few contradictions hanging in there. Now, the Chicago School. How many of you have heard of this concept of the Chicago School? Not many. The Chicago school is clearly, as I said, an American school. By the way, there is no such thing as a New York school. We're talking school of urbanism, huh? School in the sense of a theory, a mode of conceiving. The Chicago school is quite different, even though Robert Park and some of the other critical figures all studied in Germany, including with Simmel. So, you know, this is, I must say, this is a very Germanic moment for the urban. No matter that London was the biggest city, remember where I started? It's really the German thinkers that dominate a lot of this discussion of urbanity. Now, the Chicago school, which starts again in the early 1900s, is actually deviates quite strongly. It loses that romanticism, it loses all of that, and it becomes quite interestingly practical. It lasted for a while. It's still, I mean, many people still consider themselves Chicago school urban scholars. The French, for instance, love the Chicago school because there's a kind of rationality. You know, the French mode is marked by a kind of rationality of very high level that you don't see in the Germans. The Germans don't have that. They have a different. So there are, I mention all of this I just want you to have a sense that there are these different cultures that come in play once cities become such a dominant mode, and hence also different interpretations of what is this animal we're looking at. And I repeat, I would argue that today we again need a whole new set of instruments to understand our cities, because they don't fit into this stuff. And to simply look at them, the dominant mode in urban scholarship today is really to look at all the problems. You know, I mean, all the problems. That is descriptive and can become prescriptive. But what you are losing in that mode, I would say, is what is the animal I'm looking at. So when I have in the past, you may or may not remember this or have heard me say it, when I say that density, which for a long time was the marker, okay, if it's dense, it's a city. Today there are densities, built densities, that actually de-urbanize the city. They are a negative. They do not add to urbanity. Whereas what some of these earlier scholars are seeing, that concentration of buildings and people and diverse uses and different practices that marks cityness to them. In today's city, you have to actually interrogate what kind of density am I looking at. The same thing with public space. I don't know if any of you has picked up, there's a whole debate now raging in the UK. The UK has a lot of very beautiful public plazas, but they're all privately owned. So this has generated a huge debate. So there is a whole new mode of reinterpreting urban space and also contesting some of the practices, etc. So it looks public, but it's actually private. Now, so Park, back to Park, they drew on the German academic perspective of Simmel and Weber, American pragmatism of John Dewey, and social reform traditions of Jane Addams. Does anybody know about Jane Addams? She was a formidable figure in Chicago. She was to helping the poor. She set up a whole set of organizations to help the poor. Now, they pushed very hard, the Chicago School, for empirical research, and especially ethnographies that would capture it. I'm not going to. So in an earlier scholarship, you have urban life versus urban problems. That's a more modern mode, as I already said. And that's a loss, I would say, in the quality of the theorizing of cities, because it's just a question of the urban problems and not urban life. A central paradox in all of this is that the modern city combines numbers and scales that have never been seen before, yet produces a particular kind of individualism. So those who are just looking at the scale and the masses, and then those who are looking at the individualisms that emerge in this setting, you know, there is a kind of a debate around these kinds of issues. Now, moving to the contemporary scholarship, the one that I'm not so impressed with, it's a concern with social problems. I totally understand the necessity to look at that, but it becomes a long, long list of all the problems. And it's a very long list, and I completely agree with the list, all those items. But it leaves out, I repeat now what I just said, this notion that we have also the making of a new type of city. And if you're just looking at the problems have been there really from the beginning, that we had sort of bigger cities for 100 years, you could say. Whereas these new emergent conditions that are being overshadowed by the list of problems are telling us a different type of tale. So I would say it's sort of a moment to go back to some instruments that allow you to discover rather than just, you know, measure all the sort of the problems. Now, I wanted to, the city a distinct entity, you get this, right? The classical modernists such as Simmel and Benjamin, the city is a distinct entity. They emphasize the specificity of modern urban culture. The whole question of culture is sort of, it's like a marriage between the emergence of cities and the emergence of cultures for these types of German thinkers, different from non-urban culture and from the social life associated with non-urban modern spatial forms. The city as a site, this is also a romanticism, but it's an interesting one, and it actually is a bit that way. But it is, the formulation is a bit of a romanticism. So as a site for acute awareness and experiencing of the features of modernity. Now, that in today's cities, you don't see very much of that, because everybody is, you know, looking at their phone or have music, and there is no curiosity, and probably for very good reasons about, oh my God, what is this? No. But for these scholars, it was discovering, and then the need to narrate something. That is completely finished today. I mean, it's just amazing. And it's understandable. I'm not saying people are crazy, not sure. Now, the city as a site for acute awareness and experiencing of features of modernity, finished, okay? Finito. Now, the Marxist sociologists and urbanists, they could be economists too, but they contest even the notion that there is such a thing as a city. They just see the city, what we call the city, as a sort of outcome of particular modes in which our economy is organized. That's a pretty radical move. Harvey, who has heard of Harvey, our Harvey? There are many Harveys, but I mean our urban Harvey. Okay, Harvey is absolutely brilliant, a thinker, very attached to Marx. I don't know if people know that too, but very. He has brought Marx back. Marx was sort of a bit put in the, what do you call, the din of history, the dustbin of history. And he was there teaching, I don't know where he was exactly, at Duke, I think. And he had 3 people in his class, and he taught that class for 20 years on Marx. And of course, then, suddenly Marx was rediscovered. You know, this is also very funny. Marx was absolutely, nobody was sort of interested. You know, we thought we knew what it was. And he really brought him back. And so Harvey, David Harvey, he's the kind of person who would say there is no such thing as a city. What we're looking at is a set of outcomes of economic processes that are geared towards certain aims. Now, of course, we know that the materiality of the city is there, but when he says that, it's not that he's crazy or that he lives in a rural area and thinks there are no cities. It's just he says what we call the city, and by saying that, we prioritize the notion of the urban. He wants us to move away from that prioritizing and to look at what are the economic systems and logics in play that 100 years ago begin to produce what we now call the city. So it's not that he denies the existence of these, concentrations of houses and businesses and traffic and I don't know what all. I mean, he can see that. But the way the urbanists have constructed it, the way we all generally talk about it, is like the city. That is a problem for him. And there are other French scholars who also have sort of raised questions about what really is the city. And for those of you who are slightly theoretically inclined, you can see that that would be an interesting question. Just because we call it the city, just because it's there, it's visible, what else is it? It's a city. Does not mean that calling it a city is what explains the nature of the animal. And the struggles that those early scholars had to try to capture, well, what is this, is a good thing to remember when you then try to understand, well, what's happening today? What are the instruments we need to understand, et cetera, et cetera. So my project, Who Owns the City, which is a provocative title clearly, but it is based on quite a bit of very alarming data, is another point of entry to say, well, to simply say the city, careful, that lasted for a while, for about 100 years. Now, and there's still a lot of that. Most cities are a city, so to speak. But there is an emergent new mode that I've talked about in the past. I'll probably talk about it again at some point, that de-urbanizes the city. No matter the densities, no matter the people, no matter the urban look. It actually de-urbanizes. It kills some of the basic dynamics that mark a city. So, when you enter the realm of theorization, by which I mean not sort of go off, on the anything goes, but which means that you are using tools and language that is not simply the X. Like, you can't just say, oh, the city's a city. No, you have to interrogate. What is a city? And then you begin to have to construct sort of an alternative universe a bit. Now, I wanted to get to the Chicago school, but there is another part of the Chicago school. Okay, so the Chicago school, all of that, et cetera, et cetera. The Chicago school really takes a certain kind of methodology and takes it to the extreme. And so what you see here when I say, the city as well, their effort was to define city culture as a unitary phenomenon, contrasting it. This is not the Chicago school, this is the old scholars. The Chicago school, what it wants to do, so that is to sets out to deal with the city in an opposite way of all of that other stuff that I've been talking about. And the focus is on the internal character of the city. Now, I want to ask you a question. I want you to see if you can answer this question. So the Chicago school, given their project, you can read this a bit more there, says that slums, poor neighborhoods, red light districts, that's all good. What are they getting at? They say also all the other things are good, but I'm saying all the negatives. So what tends to be seen in today's urban analyses as trouble, problematic, negative. The Chicago school says, no, that's good, that's okay. It's part of how, it's good for a city. Besides all the good things, I repeat, they didn't just focus on that. What analytic sort of pathway would lead them to say that? What else are they saying when they say that? So in other words, you have a red light district, you have all the things that you don't want on the vice vector, that today, some of that stuff today we would not call vice. You put it all together in one area rather than enabling it to sort of, in a nice little neighborhood, suddenly there you have a bordello. So now, what about dilapidated neighborhoods or very low income, low quality housing? What is the functionality for the Chicago school of that? Now, this is a Chicago a certain kind of Chicago, huh? We're talking about the mid 1900s. We're talking, there's a lot of stuff happening. But what would that be? This is how you have to think about it. When the Chicago school asks that, it asks, so it's for the city. Why is it good for the city to have a red light district? Because you have it all concentrated, you can a bit control it, you let it do its stuff, so you accept that, this, whether we want it or not, we're going to have that. So we have it, we accept it, which took a bit of courage, in a very moralistic society, saying, yeah, let's just have a red light district, but we put it all there, right? What about poor quality housing or dilapidated neighborhoods? What would have been the element there in that school of thought? And remember, Chicago is, a very dynamic city at that point. They needed a lot of low-wage workers. So you see what the rationalism is of that school. It says, well, if you want to have a lot of low-wage workers for the factories that are exploding all over the place, you have to have low-income housing. And if the only low-income housing you have is this kind of a dilapidated neighborhoods where those workers can at least, have an aspiration to buying something or renting and then fixing it up. That is how practical it was. So you understand, and they did element by element, like it was a rational display of a city, a working city where you have enormous dynamism. Remember, Chicago was the most dynamic city in the United States, more dynamic than New York, in terms of the factories and the whole industrial and transport world. They needed a lot of low-wage workers. And they also set up facilities for blacks from the South, sort of the famous Cabrini Green, that was mostly blacks, and there was a very dynamic situation, a lot of demand for workers, and a very practical, applied dimension. Now, more elusive, but interesting, and again important to understand, is the notion of the deviant. In today's world, in America, when you say the deviant, it's a negative, right? I mean, we who are countercultural, we say deviant is great. But the norm, the sort of whatever, we say a deviant is known as somebody who is somehow deviating from the rules of the game. Again, in a city like New York, people like to be considered deviants, because it's more interesting. But we're not talking about New York. We're talking about an earlier period in Chicago, where you had a lot of moralisms, attenti, all of that stuff. Anyhow, so here is a figure that for the Chicago school is emblematic of the urbanite. Polish woman leaves her Polish neighborhood, kisses, to the grandmother and the uncle and the whatever, and then very Polish moment, okay? I say Polish because this is actually the example that they chose. It could have been many other nationalities. There were many other foreign. And because it's a foreign, but in a strong neighborhood situation, it is a good example. So she leaves the house, the kisses and the bye-byes, and then she enters, I have already mentioned this here once, this example. Then she enters the traffic, the transport system. In the subway, the train, whatever, she cannot be kissing, and she's silent probably, standing alone. She becomes a different kind of subject. Then she arrives at the office where she's working. There she's again different, because there she has to say, but she's not the Polish co-worker, she is the co-worker in Chicago, right? Then after work, she goes to have a drink with the girls, as they would say. The other women working in the, young women working in the, and then they are again different, very effusive, etc. And then she goes back to her home at the end of the long day, and there she re-enters the transport system where she doesn't talk to anybody, and then she arrives home and the kiss is a hi, hi, hi. Now, from the Chicago school perspective, this is the urbanite. The urbanite is foundationally a deviant. So they gave to the term deviant, we have shrunken the meaning, not we, I don't mean we as in me and other, no, but it has happened that way. We have shrunken the term deviant to some sort of a negative for a very long time. Now that is beginning to be liberated, but in the Chicago school, way back when, again, in very conservative modes of thinking, they say the urbanite is the person who can take on all these different personas, and that person is a deviant, continuously deviating from the rules of the game or whatever it might be. Now, when you then stand back and you look at some of this stuff that the Chicago school did, one sort of is really, it's quite impressive. They felt free to use the language, the terms, and to invent a whole new way of mapping urbanity and the urbanite, the city, etc. And it had an extraordinary impact, that school of thought. And again, as I mentioned already, the French loved it because of its rationality, because there was no fear of saying, whom could we offend? No, that this is a rational system. But so that in there hangs very, very deeply that notion of the urbanite as a deviant. Now, when we enter our more recent years, the obsession becomes deviance as a foundationally negative term. Compared to the Chicago school, that was a loss of complexity. The Chicago school had a complex understanding and ultimately said, look, the urban subject, the one who is truly an urbanite, which is a term that we admire and respect and love, the notion of the urbanite, is a deviant. And then you see the deviant becomes this very narrow definition, charged, moreover, with racist elements and I don't know what all. I mean, there was a bit of racism then too in that other language, but still, we lost enormous ground in terms of sort of a broad vista, a broad landscape of what the urban condition was. Now, so the other sort of mode that they have of working the material is the notion of the city as artifactual. What does that mean? Artifact. What does the term, this is a question to all of you, what does the term artifact, what is that? What does that mean?
It's man-made.
It's made, exactly. We make it. So, and this, I can assure you that this is a question I've asked University of Chicago, etc. Very few people understand. The artifact is a term that it's kind of a self-evident. It tells its own nature, so to say. Artifact, fact, making, etc. And effecticity, and nobody sees it that way. But for the Chicago school, they say the city is artifactual. We made it. We make it. All its different elements. The we here is a rhetorical we, you understand that, right? And so this is an extraordinarily practical notion, and it means that we can change it. And I would say that is exactly what's happening now. The artifactual element is still there, but it's going in a very negative direction, I would say, and with de-urbanizing, as I have already mentioned. But this notion of the artifacts of industrial cities, of course, in the case of Chicago, you had, has anybody seen sort of the, some of the big machines that you use in mining or that you use when you're building train tracks or Chicago was a city where the artifactual was just in your face all over. Today, it's no longer that way. Today, everything is sort of seems to be rendered invisible of that sort. But this notion of the city as the artifactual is actually a very, very interesting element. And I think I'm going to leave you with that. Yeah, I leave you with that. Okay.